There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a valley between two armies, not the stillness of a peaceful morning or the quiet of a landscape simply going about its own patient existence. This is a more charged stillness, the held breath of two forces facing each other across open ground, neither moving, neither yielding, the air between them full of something that has not yet resolved itself into action. This is a peaceful story from the ancient scriptures, set aside for the quiet hours of night. Let it carry you gently toward rest. The valley we are thinking of was the Valley of Elah, a wide, flat-bottomed valley in the Shephelah, the foothills region that lay between the coastal plains of Philistia and the central highlands of Judah. The name meant Terebinth Valley, named for the large shade trees that grew there, the broad crown trees that dotted the landscape of that region and provided shelter from the fierce Mediterranean sun. It was a strategic valley. Valleys in the ancient landscape of Canaan were not simply geographical features. They were the routes through which armies moved, the passages between the highlands and the lowlands, the corridors of access that military planners understood and sought to control. The Valley of Elah connected the Philistine coastal territory to the heartland of Judah, and whoever controlled it controlled movement between the two. The Philistines had gathered their armies in the valley. They had occupied one hillside. The Israelites had gathered in response and occupied the facing hillside. Between them was the valley floor, flat, open, the ground where the issue between the two armies would eventually be decided. And for 40 days, nothing had moved. The Philistines were the long-standing adversaries of Israel in this period. They occupied 5 major city-states along the southern coastal plain: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. And they were a formidable military power. They had iron technology, which gave them weapons and tools of a hardness and durability that the Israelites largely lacked. They had a professional military culture. Their armies were organized and equipped and experienced in the kind of warfare that the ancient Near Eastern world conducted. The Israelites, under Saul, had their own army, assembled from the tribes, organized by commanders, equipped as best as the available resources allowed. But they were facing an adversary with significant advantages, and the confrontation in the Valley of Elah had settled into a kind of stalemate, with neither side willing to make the first full commitment. What the Philistines had decided to do instead was to send a champion. His name was Goliath. He was from Gath, one of the 5 Philistine cities, set in the foothills not far from the Valley of Elah. The ancient account describes him with measured care, and the description has stayed in the world's memory for 3,000 years. He was tall, very tall, the ancient text giving measurements that would put him somewhere around 9 feet by some interpretations, or somewhat less by others, but unmistakably enormous by any human standard. His armor was elaborate and heavy, a bronze helmet, a coat of scale armor whose bronze weight the ancient account specifies, bronze armor on his legs, a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, the ancient text says, the kind of shaft that holds the weighted frame of a large loom, thick and heavy and solid. The iron spearhead alone weighed many pounds, and before him walked a shield-bearer, a separate person whose sole function was to carry the large shield that went before Goliath, protecting him as he advanced. This was a warrior designed to inspire awe. Every detail of his equipment was calculated to communicate size, strength, and the kind of power that resists opposition. Each morning and each evening for 40 days, Goliath came out from the Philistine lines and called across the valley. He called for a man to come and fight him. A single combat, the ancient practice of champion warfare, in which the result of a battle between the two armies' best fighters would stand in for the result of full battle. Why have the full armies clash with all the casualties that entailed, when the matter could be decided by two men? This arrangement was known in the ancient world. It was a form of warfare that the ancient texts describe in various contexts. Two champions meeting to settle a dispute between their respective peoples. The loser's people would submit to the winner's people. This was the offer Goliath made every morning and every evening for 40 days. "Send a man to fight me," he called. "If he can kill me, we will be your servants. But if I kill him, you will be our servants and serve us." The call went out across the valley. The Israelites heard it, and the ancient account says plainly what their response was. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. 40 days of this. Every morning and every evening, the enormous armored figure coming out to the edge of the Philistine lines, calling across the valley. And every morning and every evening, the Israelite army hearing and being afraid. Far from the valley of Elah, in the town of Bethlehem, in the hill country of Judah, a family went about its ordinary life. Their father was named Jesse. He was an old man by this point, too old for military service, too old to be among the men who had gone down to the valley with Saul's army. He had 8 sons, and 3 of the eldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, had followed Saul to the war. They were in the army camp, on the hill above the valley, among the men who heard Goliath's challenge every morning and every evening. The youngest son stayed in Bethlehem with his father. His name was David. He was a shepherd. He kept his father's sheep, the routine, patient work of watching over animals in the hills around Bethlehem, moving them from pasture to pasture, keeping them together, protecting them from the dangers that the open hillside presented. It was a young man's work, common enough in the agricultural world of ancient Judah. Shepherding required attention and endurance, and the willingness to spend long hours alone in the field with no company but the animals and the landscape. David was not simply a shepherd by occupation. He was, the ancient account suggests, a person of remarkable interior life, someone who brought something unusual to the ordinary work. He had a gift for music. He played the lyre, and his playing was described elsewhere as skilled and pleasing. He sang songs that would become, in the later tradition, some of the most beloved poetry in the ancient scriptures. The hills around Bethlehem, where David kept the sheep, are the hills of the Judean highlands. The same limestone ridges and terraces and valleys that appear throughout the ancient accounts of this land. They are not dramatic mountains, but they have a quality of presence. The wide sky above, the distant glint of the Dead Sea visible in certain directions, the particular silence of a person alone with animals on a hillside in the early morning. David in those hills with his sheep, playing his lyre in the evening, watching for lions and bears. The ancient account will mention these, the predators that a shepherd had to be prepared to face, making the music of the Psalms perhaps in the long quiet hours of the pastoral life. He did not know what was happening in the valley to the west. He was tending sheep. Jesse called his youngest son and gave him a task. "Take this for your brothers," he said. "Roasted grain and bread, 10 loaves of it, and 10 cuts of cheese for the commander of their 1,000. Go see how your brothers are, and bring back assurance from them." A father's errand, the practical care of a man who could not go himself, sending provisions to the sons who were in the field, asking for news, wanting the reassurance that they were well. Bread and grain for the brothers, cheese for the officer. Go, see, come back and tell me. David rose in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, someone to watch over what he was temporarily leaving, and took everything Jesse had told him to take. He set out for the camp. The road from Bethlehem to the valley of Elah passed through the hill country and then down into the Shephelah. It was not a long journey, but it was a journey that crossed from the familiar uplands where David had spent his life into territory that was, for him, new. The lower hills, the broader valleys, the region where the two armies were facing each other in the standoff that had now stretched to 40 days. He arrived at the army camp as the host was going out to the battle line. At the moment when the soldiers were forming up, shouting the war cry, taking their positions on the hillside, there was movement and noise and the particular controlled chaos of an army preparing to face another army across an open expanse. David left his supplies with the keeper of the baggage, the person responsible for the equipment and provisions at the rear of the camp. He ran to the battle line to find his brothers. He found them. He was greeting them, exchanging the words of brothers who have been apart for some time. And then Goliath came out. The Philistine champion came forward from the lines as he had come forward every morning and every evening for 40 days. He called out his challenge across the valley, the words that by now every man in the Israelite army had heard so many times, they knew them by heart. "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." The ancient account says, when all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were very much afraid. David was standing among them when the call came out. He was hearing it for the first time. The men around him, men who had been hearing it for 40 days, responded as they had been responding for 40 days. They drew back. The fear had settled so deeply into the camp that it had become the default response, automatic, expected. But David did not draw back. He did not draw back, and he began to ask questions. He asked the men standing near him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Two things at once in his question. A practical inquiry. What is the reward for dealing with this? And a theological one, if we can use so formal a word. Who does this man think he is, defying the armies of the living God? The men around him told him what they knew. The king had promised great rewards, wealth, his daughter in marriage, freedom for his father's household in Israel. The reward had been named and was known in the camp. It was substantial. David kept asking. The same question essentially rephrased. The men kept answering. Eliab, the eldest of Jesse's sons, heard David talking to the men, and he was angry. The anger of an older brother who has been in a difficult situation for 40 days and has just watched his youngest sibling arrive with the family provisions and immediately begin asking questions that imply he might be willing to do something no one else has been willing to do. This is a recognizable kind of anger. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demanded. "And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Every sentence a small diminishment. The few sheep, the wilderness, presumption, evil of heart. Come to gawk at the spectacle." David answered his brother as mildly as the occasion allowed. "What have I done now? Was it not but a word?" He turned away from Eliab. He kept asking the same questions to others, and the word came back the same way each time. Eventually, someone told the king that there was a young man asking unusual questions, and David was summoned to Saul. David came before Saul, the same Saul who had been hiding among the baggage when his name was called at Mizpah, who had been tall and head and shoulders above all the people, who had been told he would save the people from the Philistines. That Saul, who had now been king for years and had fought many battles and had before him the problem that had been before him for 40 days. David said, "Let no man's heart fail because of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight with him." Saul looked at this young man who had just arrived in the camp. His response was practical and not unkind. "You are not able to go against this Philistine and fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." The assessment was not wrong. By any ordinary military calculation, the comparison was absurd. Goliath had been training for warfare since his youth. He was a professional soldier of the most formidable kind, equipped with the best armor and weapons available. David was a shepherd boy from Bethlehem who had come to bring bread to his brothers. But David had something to say about youth and experience. He told Saul about the lion and the bear. "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father," he said, "and when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And if it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck it and killed it. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears. This Philistine shall be like one of them," he said, "since he has defied the armies of the living God. And then, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." There is a pattern in what David said to Saul that is worth noticing quietly. He did not say, "I am brave enough." He did not say, "I am strong enough." He did not say, "I have a plan that will work." He said, "The Lord who delivered me before will deliver me again." His confidence was not in his own ability, though his ability was real. The lion and the bear were not small dangers, and a shepherd who had survived encounters with both was not nothing. His confidence was in the continuity of what he had experienced. What had been true in the hills around Bethlehem, in those specific encounters that no one else had seen, and that might have seemed to have nothing to do with Philistine military confrontations. What had been true that was being carried forward? The Lord who delivered me then. The past faithfulness was the foundation of the present trust. Saul said, "Go, and the Lord be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own armor, his own coat of mail, his own bronze helmet. He put a sword on David over the armor. And David tried to walk. He could not. He said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I am not used to them." He took them off. This small episode, the armor that didn't fit, that David tried on and then removed, is one of the moments in this story that has most engaged the imagination of those who have read and told it across 3,000 years. The king's armor, offered with genuine intention, simply did not suit the person putting it on. It was Saul's armor, sized for Saul, shaped by Saul's years of military service. It was the armor of a king. David had not been trained in the armor of a king. He had been trained in the hills with the sheep. He had the weapons and the skills that those hills had given him. He took the armor off. He took his staff in his hand, his shepherd's staff, the ordinary tool of his ordinary work. He chose 5 smooth stones from the brook in the valley, taking his time, the ancient account implies, selecting them, feeling their weight and smoothness. He put them in his shepherd's pouch. He took his sling in his hand, and he came toward Goliath. The sling was not a toy. It is easy, at this distance, to think of the sling as a child's plaything, to underestimate what it was in the hands of a skilled and practiced user. A sling in the ancient world was a weapon that armies used, that individual warriors used, that shepherds used against predators. It was a leather or woven pocket on 2 cords, designed to hold a stone and to be swung in a whirling motion before releasing one cord, sending the stone at high speed toward its target. Skilled slingers could achieve considerable accuracy at considerable distance. The stones David selected from the brook, smooth, rounded, of a size that fit the pocket of the sling, were exactly the right ammunition for this weapon. David had been using a sling, in all likelihood, since he was old enough to help with the sheep. He had used it against lions and bears. He had practiced the motion until it was automatic, until the release and the accuracy were as natural to his body as walking. He was not bringing a toy to a weapon fight. He was bringing the right weapon, the weapon he knew, the one that had been proven in the encounters that the hills around Bethlehem had given him. And the 5 smooth stones from the brook were chosen with care, not one stone chosen in confidence. 5 stones, enough for the work, whatever the work required, not reckless, not overconfident in either direction. 5 stones. Goliath saw David coming. The ancient account describes what this looked like from Goliath's side. He came forward, and his shield-bearer before him, and he saw David and disdained him. The word implies something stronger than mere dismissal. He looked at the young man crossing the valley toward him and felt contempt. And he said, "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" He saw the staff. He saw the youth. He did not see a threat. He saw an insult. The Israelite army had sent a shepherd boy, armed with a walking stick and a pocket, as their response to the champion of Philistia. He cursed David. He said, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." David answered Goliath. The words he spoke across the valley on that morning are among the most quoted in all the ancient scriptures. We will hold them quietly rather than pressing them hard, letting them rest in the imagination as words spoken by a young shepherd in a valley to a heavily armored warrior who had just finished cursing him. "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin," David said. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And then, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And then the line that gathers everything, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. The battle is the Lord's. This is the center of David's confidence, not his skill with the sling, real as it was, not his past encounters with lions and bears, formative as they were, not even his anger at the 40 days of defiance directed at the armies of the living God, motivating as that was. The battle is the Lord's. David went into the confrontation with the understanding that he was not the primary actor in what was about to happen. He was going in the name of the Lord, carrying that name into the valley, carrying it as the thing his confidence rested on. The weapon in his hand was real. The stone in the sling was real. The skill he had developed in the hills was real. But the battle was not his to win by his own power. This is the particular kind of courage that the story carries. Not the courage of someone who believes he is strong enough to prevail, but the courage of someone who believes the one he serves is faithful enough that the outcome can be trusted. The Lord saves not with sword and spear. When Goliath rose and came forward to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line. He ran toward the enormous armored warrior, not away, not cautiously, quickly toward. The approach of someone who has made a decision and is not reconsidering it. He put his hand in his bag. He took out a stone. He slung it. The stone struck Goliath in the forehead. It sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. The ancient account gives this in simple, declarative sentences, the way it describes all its most significant moments: the stone taken, the stone slung, the stone striking, the giant falling. There is no elaboration of what it looked like, no description of the moment from the inside, no dwelling on the spectacle of the fall. Simply, the stone struck, he fell. David ran and stood over Goliath. He took hold of the Philistine's sword, the warrior's own weapon, and drew it out of its sheath and killed him with it. Then he cut off his head. The ancient account includes this detail without particular relish. It was the conclusion of the combat, the action that confirmed that the contest was over. In the ancient practice of champion warfare, the decisive act needed to be clear and unmistakable. David used the warrior's own sword for the conclusion. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled, and the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath, to the gates of Ekron. The valley that had been frozen in 40 days of standoff was suddenly in motion. Let the mind come to rest for a moment in the image of David at the brook. Before the confrontation, before the running toward, before the stone and the fall, there was this: a young man kneeling at the water's edge in the valley floor between the two armies, reaching into the moving current, selecting stones. The ancient account says 5 smooth stones from the brook. Smooth because smooth stones flew straighter and held their trajectory better than rough ones. From the brook, actual water, actual stones, the real stream bed of the actual valley of Elah, which still exists and through which water still moves when the seasonal rains come. David bent over the water and chose. There is something very grounded in this image. The most significant act of this young man's life up to this point was preceded by a practical, careful, unhurried task: choosing the right ammunition, not gathering in a rush, not grabbing whatever came to hand, selecting, feeling the smoothness of the stone against his fingers, weighing it in his palm, choosing it or setting it aside and choosing another. 5 stones, enough. The brook in the valley of Elah is exactly the kind of brook that a shepherding culture would know well. A seasonal stream, running when the rains came and drying to a trickle or nothing in the summer, its bed full of the water-rounded stones that accumulated over many seasons of flow. Shepherds knew such brooks. They had watered their animals at them, had rested beside them in the heat of midday, had listened to the particular sound of small water moving over smooth stone. David was at home at a brook. He was in completely familiar territory, doing what his hands knew how to do, reaching into the water and choosing what he needed. And then he rose and walked across the valley toward the largest thing he had ever faced. There is a period of time, brief, measured in the minutes it took for David to cross the valley floor, between his choosing of the stones and the moment of the throw. The ancient account is spare about what happened in those minutes. David ran toward the battle line. Goliath came forward to meet him. Words were exchanged, the challenge and the response, the defiance and the counter. And then David put his hand in his bag. In those minutes of crossing, David was carrying everything the story has shown us. The hills around Bethlehem, the early mornings with the sheep, the lion that came and the bear that came, and the lambs recovered from their mouths, the music of the lyre in the long afternoons, the anointing that had happened in his father's house when Samuel had come to Bethlehem and had passed over the elder brothers and had looked at the youngest son and poured oil on his head. David did not know at this moment what the oil on his head had meant for the long term. He was not yet king. He would not be king for many years. The anointing was a beginning whose full meaning had not yet arrived. But it had happened, and he had been shaped by the years of his life, by the hills and the sheep and the music and the lions and the bears and the brook with its smooth stones, into the person who was now crossing the valley toward Goliath. The older brothers had been brought before Samuel. They were impressive, the way Saul had been impressive. Tall, strong, the kind of men who looked like what the occasion required. And the word had come to Samuel about each of them. Not this one, not this one. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. David had been in the field with the sheep when Samuel came. He had to be sent for, fetched, brought in from wherever the youngest son was. And when he came in, the word came, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he. This is the one who is now crossing the valley with 5 smooth stones in his shepherd's bag and a sling in his hand. The one the Lord had seen, the one looked at from the inside." The story of David and Goliath has been told to children and to adults in every era since it was first recorded, as a story about courage, about the small facing the large, about the apparently weak prevailing against the apparently strong. These are real elements of the story, and they are worth holding gently. But the particular quality of David's courage in this story is worth attending to more carefully, because it is not simply the courage of bravery, the willingness to do a dangerous thing. Many people are brave in that sense. What David's courage rested on was something more specific. He had a track record, the lion, the bear. Those encounters had not been theoretical. David had been in genuine danger, had faced genuine threat, and had come through. Not because he was invincible, not because nothing bad could happen to him, but because in those specific encounters, he had acted and the acting had been enough. And he carried those experiences into the valley. He did not say to Saul, "I am brave enough." He said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." His courage was built on testimony, on what he had already seen to be true, not on a theory about how things would work out, not on a general faith in good outcomes, but on the specific remembered reality of what had happened in the hills when the lion came and the lamb was in its mouth. This is a particular kind of trust that is available only to those who have lived through something. Not inherited trust, not theoretical trust. The trust that comes from having been brought through something and knowing from the inside what that was like. David had that. The hills had given it to him, and he walked into the valley carrying it. There was an army on each hillside watching. The Israelite army on the east side of the valley, the Philistine army on the west side. Thousands of men, armed and positioned and afraid, had been in this standoff for 40 days. And now a shepherd boy was crossing the valley floor toward the champion of Philistia. The ancient account does not dwell on the watching army, but it is present in the story as a backdrop. All those men who had drawn back every morning and every evening when the challenge came, who had heard their king's offer of reward and had not moved, who were now watching the youngest son of Jesse of Bethlehem do what none of them had done. When the stone struck, when Goliath fell, when the pursuit began, the army that had been frozen in fear was suddenly in motion. The same men who had drawn back, who had been afraid, who had heard the challenge 40 times and not responded, now rose with a shout and ran. This detail in the story is not a judgment on the men of the army. They were soldiers facing a genuinely formidable opponent. Their fear was not irrational. The assessment that no single combat with Goliath was likely to end well was a reasonable assessment, but the reasonable assessment had kept them still for 40 days. And what broke the stillness was not a change in the military balance. Goliath was still Goliath, right up until the moment the stone struck his forehead. What broke the stillness was one person doing something that the assessment had said was not possible. When what was impossible became visibly possible, the whole army moved. There is something in this about the relationship between individual action and communal response, about how a single person acting with a particular kind of trust can change what a whole community believes is available to them. But we will hold this gently, not press it into a lesson. It is simply what happened in the valley. The day in the valley of Elah ended very differently than it had begun. What had been a frozen standoff for 40 days was resolved in a few minutes by a stone and a sling. The Philistine lines broke and ran, and the Israelite army pursued them. The pursuit that broke the standoff becoming the pursuit that broke the Philistine army, at least for this campaign. They ran all the way to the gates of their own cities. David had the head of Goliath, a grim detail that the ancient account includes and that belonged to the ancient practice of demonstrating a decisive victory. He also had Goliath's weapons, which he would later deposit in a specific place of safekeeping, and which appear again later in his story. He was brought before Saul. Abner, the commander of the army, brought him, and Saul asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." The story of David and Goliath ends, in the ancient account, with this brief exchange, not with a celebration, not with an elaborate acknowledgement of what had just happened, with a simple question and a simple answer. "Whose son are you?" "I am the son of Jesse, the shepherd boy from Bethlehem, the youngest son who had been in the field with the sheep when Samuel came, the one who had been anointed with oil while his brothers stood nearby, not yet understanding what was being done, the one who had carried bread and grain and cheese to his brothers in the camp and arrived at the moment the morning challenge went out. He stood before the king with the answer to 40 days of defiance in his hands, and he gave his name and his father's name. Nothing more. Precisely what was asked. It is worth returning, in the quiet of this hour, to the hills around Bethlehem, not the valley, not the confrontation, not the stone and the fall, but the place where David spent his years before any of this, the place where the shepherd boy lived his ordinary life before the day his father sent him with bread and cheese. The hills around Bethlehem are the hills of the Judean highlands, the same landscape that runs through so much of this ancient story. Limestone and terraces, olive trees, and occasional patches of scrubby woodland, the long ridges running north and south with the valleys between them. Quiet, mostly. The particular silence of a hillside in the early morning before the day has heated up, when the dew is still on the grass and the animals are grazing in the cool of the first light. David in those hills. Day after day, year after year, the sheep his only company, the landscape his only context. This is where the music came from. The psalms that bear his name, whatever their exact history and authorship, carry the mark of a person who had spent long hours alone with the landscape and with the silence, who had felt the smallness of a human being under a vast sky and had responded to that smallness not with anxiety, but with something more like wonder and trust. The heavens declare the glory of God, one of the psalms says. The firmament shows his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. These are the words of someone who had watched the sky for a very long time, who had seen the day come and the night come and the day come again, and had received it as something worth paying attention to, worth pondering, worth putting into words. The shepherd on the hillside, watching the sky. The Lord is my shepherd. Another psalm, one of the most beloved in the tradition. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. A shepherd, writing about being shepherded. Someone who knew from the inside what it was to guide a flock to water, to find the green pasture when the dry season had come, to lead the sheep through the valley where the shadows were deep, writing about what it was like to be the one led. The hills around Bethlehem were the school where David learned everything the valley would require, not as a preparation for the valley, not as a conscious curriculum, simply as life, the life he was given to live, the work he was given to do, the landscape he was given to inhabit. And when the valley came, the hills had made him ready. The story of David and Goliath has been carried by people for 3,000 years because it speaks to something that does not change in the human experience. There will always be valleys. There will always be the thing that stands across the open ground and calls out its challenge, morning and evening, making the challenge seem permanent and the answer seem impossible. There will always be the 40 days of hearing the same intimidating fact and drawing back from it. And there will always, the story suggests, be the possibility of the person who has lived in the hills long enough to know a different truth, who carries a different assessment of the situation, rooted not in a naive underestimation of the difficulty, but in a specific remembered experience of being brought through something. The battle is the Lord's, not a formula, not a magic phrase that makes the stone fly straighter. A statement of trust rooted in testimony, in the lion and the bear, in the specific encounters that had been survived, in the track record of a faithfulness that had been experienced and not only heard about. The story does not promise that every stone will fly straight, or that every confrontation will end with the giant falling. The ancient scriptures are honest about the range of outcomes in the human story, and they do not guarantee that trust always produces triumph. What the story carries is not a guarantee, but an orientation. The orientation of someone who goes toward rather than away, who picks up the shepherd's weapons rather than waiting for the king's armor to fit, who chooses from the brook the stones that the brook has made smooth, who runs quickly toward the battle line. Not because the outcome is certain, but because the one in whose name the going happens has been faithful before, in specific remembered ways, and that remembered faithfulness is enough to walk on. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. Past tense, informing present trust. The valley was quiet again in the evening. The armies had moved. The standoff was broken. The ground where Goliath had stood, where he had called his challenge 40 times, where he had fallen with the stone in his forehead. This ground was empty now, returning to the ordinary state of a valley floor in the Shephelah, the terebinth trees casting their long evening shadows across the grass and the stone. The brook still ran, the same brook where David had knelt and chosen his 5 stones. The water still moved over the smooth pebbles in the way water has always moved over smooth pebbles, indifferent to what had happened on the hillside above it, continuing the patient work of rounding the stones that would still be there long after the story of this day had passed into memory. A shepherd had come to this valley to bring bread to his brothers and had found a confrontation that had been going on for 40 days and had brought it to an end with a stone from the brook. And then he had gone to stand before the king and given his name and his father's name, quietly, simply, not with elaboration, not with a speech about what had just happened, about what it meant, about what he had shown. I am the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite. The ancient account closes this chapter of the story here. The implications of what had happened in the valley would unfold over the rest of David's long and complicated life. The relationship with Saul that would become affectionate and then fearful and then dangerous. The friendship with Jonathan. The years of being hunted. The eventual becoming of the king that the anointing at Bethlehem had pointed toward. But tonight, the valley is quiet. The story has arrived at its resolution. The stone has flown, and the giant has fallen, and the army has broken, and the shepherd has stood before the king. The valley of the terebinths is still. Let the story settle now, the way the valley settles in the evening after the day's events have passed through it. The hills around Bethlehem are in the imagination tonight. The limestone ridges and the terraces, and the particular quality of the highland air in the early morning when the sheep are grazing and the shepherd is sitting with his back against a rock, and the day has not yet made its full demands. David in those hills, the music and the silence and the long days of patient work, the lions and the bears that came and were faced, and from which the lambs were recovered, the specific encounters that no one else saw, that built in a young man's bones a knowledge of what it was to be in danger and to come through. The knowledge that would become, in a valley not far from Bethlehem, the foundation of a trust too solid to be shaken by the sight of an enormous armored warrior calling his challenge across open ground. Let the 5 smooth stones rest in the imagination, chosen carefully, held in the palm, felt for their weight and smoothness, put in the shepherd's bag, not 1 stone, 5, enough for the work. The preparation that is neither reckless nor paralyzed, that takes what is available and uses it with the care and the skill that have been built up over years of ordinary practice. The sling, the staff, the shepherd's bag, the weapons of a life actually lived rather than the armor of a role not yet inhabited, and the name carried across the valley as the thing the stone flew in service of. In the name of the Lord of hosts, let the brook run in the imagination. Water over smooth stone, the particular sound of shallow water moving over a pebbled bed, cool and unhurried in the valley floor. The sound that David heard as he knelt and chose his stones. The sound that continued as he rose and crossed toward what he was going toward. The brook does not hurry. The water moves at the pace the gradient gives it, steady and consistent, independent of what happens on the hillside above. The brook was there before the standoff began, and it was running when the standoff ended, and it will run until the rain stop coming. Quiet, patient, doing what water does. Let the breath slow now. Let the body rest where it is. Let whatever has felt like Goliath in this particular day, whatever has been standing across the valley, calling its challenge morning and evening, let it settle into the night. Not resolved tonight perhaps, not fallen, but held within a story that says, the battle belongs to something larger than the 2 sides facing each other across the valley floor. You have hills behind you. Whatever years of ordinary life have given you, whatever the patient work of the life you have actually lived has put in your hands, these are not irrelevant to the valleys ahead. The lion and the bear are not wasted. The smooth stones from the brook are not too small for what they need to do. The Lord, who has delivered before, will deliver again. Let this rest in the quiet of the night, not as a demand, not as a prescription, simply as the truth that a shepherd boy carried into a valley with 5 smooth stones and a sling, and as the truth that has been carried in this story for 3,000 years of people finding in it something they needed. The valley is still, the brook is running, the stars are above the hills around Bethlehem. David is sleeping tonight, not in the valley of Elah, not in the king's camp, but wherever the young man who has done an extraordinary thing and given his name and his father's name and answered the king's question simply and without elaboration goes to sleep. He sleeps the way people sleep when they have done what they were sent to do and can rest in the completion of it. Be still now. Let sleep come the way the evening comes in the valley. Gradually, the shadows lengthening, the temperature easing, the day releasing its hold on the light. The battle is the Lord's. Rest in this tonight. Sleep. Amen.